Hi, welcome folks. This is Sean Collins with Boomi, Director of Product Management, specifically responsible for API management as part of an element of our broader platform for the connected business. So really want to share with you today a bit about where we are today with API management functionality, where we're going, and where that lies relative to where we are rolling out functionality this year. So with that being said, just to jump right in, kind of give you a perspective of where Mediate resides within the broader platform. It is obviously one of the elements of our shared unified platform. We talk about it providing for that new definition of integration platform as a service, redefining integration to incorporate no longer just data and applications, but also starting to incorporate people into that. And the importance of that then is with that targeted level of engagement. And again, not just with applications or endpoints, but also providing that facility for users to engage with that data and having a consistent means of engagement with that that's scalable and discoverable is where API design and management comes into play. So that's what we're here to talk about, obviously. And we talk about it in the Mediate aspect. It really speaks to some of the differentiation we provide from a Boomi perspective is pairing that together, that API management design and management, along with the core capabilities of our platform with the well-known capabilities we provide for integration, right? So the connectivity, transformation, logic, what have you. Providing the facility to maintain the end contract for your end consumers, but also provide that for that transformation and exposing of data endpoints that may have been previously locked away and providing for that consistent means of engagement. And additionally, providing for that transformation capability. So thinking about perhaps you want to expose multiple backend systems together as a composite application, having the facility to be able to do that very readily and easily on a configuration-based approach through Boomi. So today, what we already have available, and some of you may already be familiar with, is, again, the configuration-based approach to defining those endpoints. Through our API component, you're able to define REST, SOAP, or OData endpoints for that means of consistent engagement for those consumers. And if you drill through into more detail, this is tied to the underlying core functionality of our platform, thinking about the connectivity, as I said before, exposing these as web services that could be listening for requests and tying it to backend applications, connectivity, transformation, etc., configured through Boomi to support that. And thinking about that level of management and engagement that are important, you need to think about the persona that are engaged with that broader process. So thinking about the API providers, the individual or individuals who are responsible for managing and configuring those endpoints and making sure there's proper governance over those. And the API consumers, those who are looking to exercise those APIs across the organization or beyond the organization. So again, today, what we already have in place are the management of the deployments, thinking about the provider side of configuration of the contracts, enforcing some of the policy controls around rate limiting, quota management, maximum request size that it's allowed for consumption of those APIs. How am I authenticating to those? Am I going to be using the central governance through the atom itself, or providing for some tighter level control through existing identity providers we provide? That's through our authentication broker. Additionally, providing for the ability to define the registration of applications. And this is from the API provider side, obviously. So in this context, there's no real self-serve, but in this ability to be for an API provider to register an application, associate permitted or provisioned APIs along with their associated contracts, and passing along those keys to consumers for consumption of the APIs through their application. And then from the consumer side, obviously, discoverability through our platform, the API catalog, being able to delve more deeply into these APIs, understanding more information about them, understanding whether they're available as REST, SOAP, or OData, and then delving more deeply even to the RESTful services to be able to engage with the Swagger definitions that are automatically published as part of our RESTful endpoints to have that level of interactivity and understanding how these APIs behave in the wild. So that's all well and good for where we exist today, but understanding where our customer needs reside and where the market's kind of taking us is, again, that definition of iPaaS to really start to incorporate people. So as organizations start to evolve, they want to be able to extend the reach of their business to start to incorporate interactions with individuals outside of their organization, perhaps partners, and eventually even scale into more publicly facing APIs where they're discoverable by the broader public. So to be able to support that, we need to make sure that we start to invest in some of the broader full lifecycle API management capabilities. And what you see represented here are kind of the areas we've invested in throughout the past year, and where we're going for at least the next year in some of these aspects targetedly, specifically as part of API management. We've taken an approach here where we've had a targeted set of investigation and interviews with a set of customers and internal stakeholders over the first half of 2018, where we vetted kind of their use cases, where they're looking to go with API management, where they saw shortcomings in our existing capabilities, and specifically they saw challenges in kind of the fronting of existing services, the needs to be able to engage at scale, having the confidence and protections afforded you through a typical gateway, and then having a more broadly discoverable means of engagement, essentially the dev portal. So we've invested a lot of design and discovery process to that. And then in the second half of last year, we really delved into the development of a lot of these, and along the way continue to vet our design and discovery capabilities, discovery of those capabilities with those same stakeholders. And where we are today, going into the first quarter and second quarter of 2019, is where we're having an early adopter program where we're vetting, again, the functionality with these early adopters and starting to slowly engage with a broader set of customers, I should say, to validate the functionality meets their needs, and then targeting that will be more broadly engaging with the full API offering, enabling the gateway and developer portal functionality with that. We'll touch that on a little bit later. But essentially here what you're seeing is we've invested in the API component specifically for some of the facets of engaging not only for providing for the protections of existing APIs developed in Boomi, but also for that means of engaging or protecting for those APIs developed outside of Boomi. So I'm going to drag over where we are from and demonstrate this functionality at present. So previously, what you were somewhat limited to was the use of kind of a wrapper to ingest an external service and then be able to create an underlying Boomi process to wrap it. So essentially what you're seeing here is what was highlighted from a high-level perspective before is the endpoint, a listener endpoint, and a connector calling that existing service that you might want to be able to represent in your gateway. We found some challenges with people from a maintenance and time to value perspective with that. So what we've introduced now is the ability to do it similarly from just creating a new type of API component, which we're now terming the API proxy. And how that's enabled is now, as you create a new API, we'll call this this, and what you're seeing here is API service is what you're probably familiar with or existing in Boomi today, is that representation or front end to an existing service created in Boomi. But now we're introducing the ability to create an API proxy, which allows you to take one of two approaches, either ingesting a file or an endpoint to be able to automate the configuration to point or front this existing service that's housed externally, or you can manipulate it and configure it by hand. And what's represented in this example here is one that's been completed, essentially proxying an existing service you're probably well familiar with. It's the pet store API, providing for the definition of that, allowing you to put some versioning, sample metadata around that, and then also pointing to the server on which it's housed and fronting with authentication if that's required. So providing you essentially a component that could be published to the gateway to incorporate it into the Boomi landscape so that it can be leverage the same protections afforded you through services created in Boomi itself. Okay. So then flipping back to where we were from a full lifecycle perspective. So that's the design aspects. But thinking about the gateway and where you want to have greater levels of protection around those APIs and be able to provide even for some scalable performance gains through caching, et cetera, as you move forward. So what you'll see here is where we are today with incorporating some of the designs we've put in place. So from a configuration perspective and API management, we're now incorporating the ability to centrally configure and manage your API gateways. So what you see represented here are two different gateways, each kind of configured to front different types of environments. So thinking about in this top level case, it's fronting a test environment, whereas the bottom representation here of this gateway is fronting a production environment. So the idea is these gateways can front one or more environment, okay? And within these environment configurations, you're allowed to define what the essentially URL path would be for the endpoints published to those environments, okay? So allowing you to have that individuality for the services housed in those environments. So from a configuration perspective on this gateway, obviously providing for the protection of those services being housed in those environments, but also allows for the configuration of developer portals. So thinking about gateway as the protection mechanism and developer portal as the engagement mechanism. So as I configure my gateway, I'm also going to have the facility for the one-to-one correlation of the developer portal that pairs with that gateway to provide for that engagement layer for your discoverability and interactions as you get into subscription requests and approvals. Additionally, providing for the ability to configure authentication for entry into that developer portal to provide for that protection. And so in this case, obviously, you're able to exercise authentication sources that have already been defined as part of your authentication broker configuration. And what I'm showing here is obviously the definition of those authentication sources as part of your authentication broker. Already existing today, essentially a mechanism to take or configure authentication one of two ways. One is you can create an authentication source that exercises an external identity provider. So you can use support use cases such as OAuth2 or SAML. It allows you to define the identity provider and how this authentication source interacts with that identity provider, but also provides for the facility to directly configure authentication in the broker itself. So in this case, I've defined a basic authentication source and allows me to directly enter users into that authentication source so that I can configure this and manage this in the broker itself, and it can be used for reusable credentials across multiple different gateways and or environments. Additionally, we have some placeholders here I should point out. I'll show you in just a bit of some of where these will come into play, but as you deploy APIs, you do have the ability to, as seen before, provide for controls around, let's say, rate limiting, quota management, maximum request size, looking to bring this up to a higher level for increased flexibility of maintenance, so you can reuse a set of policies multiple times. So we're looking to do that later this year. And then from an applications perspective, largely unchanged from where we are today, but slightly changed interface to this will be occurring where one is you can create the application directly into as a provider itself. But we'll show you in just a moment from a developer portal perspective is you can take a self-service approach to registering your application and invoking kind of that request approval process for subscription to APIs. But suffice to say, from an application perspective, as I delve more deeply into some of these, here's a pre-existing example of a previous demonstration. You'll see that there's an application I've defined, and I can start to add additional APIs or add contract configurations or choose configurations for those. and enable or disable those accordingly. From a deployment perspective, this is where I get into the actual configuration of these, of the authentication and contracts that would be allowed. What you're seeing here from a contract perspective is I might create a set of policies together as a contract. So in this case, I might want to say the gold package is largely unlimited, but I could actually say the maximum message size may be a bit of a sticking point for my organization. So I'm going to limit that. My rate limit right now is unlimited, but in certain cases, I might want to put some enforcement around that. So I'm going to make this 10 calls per second limitation, and ultimately from the quota limit, I'm going to leave that unlimited. So I'll close that, but you'll see for later use, as I register an application and provide for approval of subscriptions, I can choose one of these contract sets as a plan that will be published along with that authentication, or sorry, that application and its provisioned APIs. From a catalog perspective, largely unchanged. What you see, as we talked about before, is the ability to discover these APIs, whether they're available as REST, SOAP, or OData. Delving more deeply into some of these, maybe I want to go and look at this patient API, be able to see what's available from these endpoints, how you interact with them, and again, from a visualization portal perspective, having the ability to, and then also, if I were to choose to interact with those, I could access the visualization portal to interact with a RESTful endpoint, essentially the Swagger definition for that API. Publishing is a placeholder, and I'll speak to that in just a moment, but essentially we do have a point of where we are currently with our invocation of the developer portal, and we're looking to make large investments in the user interface for that. Part of that being some of the custom metadata and descriptive information we're going to allow through this publishing interface on the API provider side. So we'll step through that in just a moment, but I want to provide for the understanding of what's in place currently before that. So then lastly, from functionality that currently exists and what we'll be engaging with our early adopters in a couple of weeks here is kind of the approval process invoked from the kind of the self-service approach to the portal. So thinking about how this whole interaction is occurring, and I'm kind of moving my way through design, deployment, and now into engagement. Really want to think about it from the persona perspective, right? So I've kind of shown you the building of these APIs and also the fronting of an existing API through a proxy, publishing this to a gateway. And now I want to get into the provider actually publishing these out to a developer portal so that they can be discovered by a developer. So the provider side, as I've kind of got into the deployment and publishing, I've essentially pushed these out to my developer portal, and I want to start to understand the experience from the app developer persona. I'm going to go in and self-register my application. I'm going to do some discovery of these APIs and ultimately want to register for use of or subscribe for use of some of these APIs. So taking that into account, this is where we are currently with the developer portal interface. I'll show you in just a moment about where we're going from a development perspective and targeting for end of Q2 for the enhancements. But suffice to say, I'll log into the developer portal as we saw before. I'm fronting it with basic auth at this point. Okay. And as I get into this developer portal, I want to actually register an application. So in this case, I'm going to call this today's demonstration, and it's January 23rd, I believe. And this is my app. So I'm going to create that application, okay? And as I get into discovery, I want to go to the catalog or the gallery, and I see quite a few of these out here. Now, we talked about it before. You might have a mixture of some that are created in Boomi as Boomi services, and some may be kind of proxying external APIs. And there's our good friend, the proxy of the pet store API. And delving through the documentation of this looks pretty interesting, and it's something I think I want to be able to use. So going back to this, I want to subscribe to this document, or this API, and I believe I call it today's application. Okay, and I'm going to send a message of I'd like to use this. Okay, I'll subscribe, and what it's doing essentially is submitting that request from the dev portal perspective, and it's awaiting approval from the admin. So going back, you'll see message was sent to there. Going back to my application and saying today's demonstration, my subscriptions, you'll see it's pending, essentially awaiting approval. Going then into the interface from an approval perspective, you'll see I now have an approval awaiting, or request awaiting approval, right? So it's pending approval. You'll see it's from today's demonstration, January 23rd, and it's waiting my approval. I'm going to go ahead and approve it. I have the facility to be able to put some limits on in place. I'm going to use the 3 call per minute plan, activating it today. I can choose to have this expire at a certain time. At present, I really don't have any need to do that, so I'm just going to have this do not automatically disable. And I'm just going to say, you're approved. Okay, so I'll approve that. And again, going back to our interface, the admin's now approved use of this application and API for this app developer. So going back into my dev portal as the app developer, I'm going to take a look at this and just refresh this to see if any changes occurred. And you'll see I've now been accepted. It says you're approved, which was the message that was sent to me. So taking a closer look at this, you'll see I now have an API key to use for interaction. So I can obviously use this for embedding into my application when I make calls to this API. Alternately, I may want to just validate that this is working as I want to. So I'm going to go into the pet store API again. I'm going to look at the documentation. And what I'm going to do is just use it as kind of like my interaction to validate the functionality meets my requirement. So I'm going to use the basic auth, incorporate the API key that was given to me. And remember that I do have a plan that was put in place that limited me to 3 calls per minute. So I'm just going to try this out, and essentially this provides for the passing of a pet key to get information on a given pet. So I'm just going to give the number 1, see what I provided with, and it provides me back Brownie as the pet. So looks pretty successful. So let me just execute that, let's say 2 more times. So that's my 3 call limit. So let me see what happens if I try to exceed that. You'll see that it does in fact enforce that limitation that I put in place. I do get the 429 error too many requests, and give it a limit, give information about the limit that was exceeded. So really just trying to show that we're now trying to support, or looking to support, and we have the core functionality to support this level of engagement to facilitate this kind of engagement at scale. From a design perspective, to kind of give you an understanding of enhancements we're making to this as we move throughout the year. So as we saw previously with the plans, this is where we see the plans going, as we'll have these as a top level reusable aspect where I can configure these plans as a combination of these different sets of policies together, obviously for reuse. Additionally, from the configuration of APIs, we talked about the deployment of these APIs. It's going to be a bit more structured by application and gateway to which they're deployed. All right, so I have that flexibility to organize by name, APIs by gateway, to provide for greater management and facility on that. And then we get into publishing. This is where we get into that aspect where I want to have a more robust engagement with my end consumers. This dev portal is all well and good, as we saw before, but obviously, admittedly, it's not super engaging, right? So we're making investments in developer portal that takes into account some custom metadata I may want to put in place. So from this perspective, I might want to add custom metadata at the top level portal itself. All right, so I can define what folks see when they first navigate to that dev portal. I may want to understand or designate which environments can actually, in fact, be fronted by this developer portal. I might want to do some custom skinning of this to be more in line with my organizational standards and look and feel. So I have the flexibility and facility to be able to do that. And for more flexibility, I might want to add some custom fields. In this case, this happens to be a university example. So there might be many uses I could use for school as a custom metadata tag, let's say. So I'm going to incorporate those for use throughout the deployment of my metadata to the dev portal. An example of a course catalog being published to my dev portal. I might want to allow for all colleges, as an example, to be able to navigate or filter to find this API. Approvals process. I want to send this as a part of a standard approval process. What you're also seeing here is a placeholder for feature functionality we're seeing probably at the end of 2019 is around setting this to a Boomi flow. And obviously, Boomi flow is one element of our broader platform and very good for kind of the workflow management. And think about an approval process. You might have multiple parties that need to be involved as part of that approval for provisioning of an API. So for this current incarnation, we're just kind of having the standard request approval from a single provider. But as we move forward, we understand we want to start to provide greater flexibility in those approval processes and see that being supported through Boomi Flow. With that being said, I may want to use a chargeback department as part of this approval process. So in this case, I can actually exercise a custom field I've defined. I can use that essentially that school field I'd used before to define that. So I could actually charge back to a given department if I wanted to take that approach, right? And then lastly, from a documentation on the individual APIs, I can provide more targeted descriptive information for that individual API and then publish it. Okay. Sorry. I'm going to make this available to only authenticated users. Cancel. So again, just go back. And then looking at it from a developer portal perspective. So then making my way back to the kind of user persona engagement. If I publish all this custom metadata out there as the provider, how does my app developer consume that? So this is what we're seeing as the next incarnation of our user interface for this developer portal. Obviously, quite refined from what we were showing previously. We're targeting this for the end of Q2, but obviously taking into account the same authentication mechanism to enter into the dev portal. We see this now incorporating some of that custom metadata tagging for some of these pieces, so I could use it for filtering to discover or find specifically targeted APIs. But in this case, perhaps I want to delve more deeply into an individual API, providing for interaction with some of the more robust descriptive and metadata that was published out there. Delving more deeply into the REST endpoint. You're seeing I have kind of the typical Swagger UI interface to this. And again, invoking kind of the ability to authorize or subscribe to this. So if I'm looking to subscribe to this, this now provides for the facility for me to create my own application if I so choose, right? So no longer am I dependent solely on the approach where the provider defines the applications and registers for me. I can actually define my own application and say that any use by this application will be charged back to this department as part of the subscription. Okay, so I've actually submitted a subscription for this API. You'll see it's awaiting approval. We talked about that approval process before, and once that's actually approved, you'll see it in my subscriptions as approved. Delving more deeply into that as before, I'll have the facility to be able to take the API key and exercise it as part of my application, right? So definite enhancements here from a user interface perspective. So those are all functionalities we see in the short term. As we think about it from a more timeline-driven perspective, the functionality I demonstrated and the usability of that, we're vetting with our early adopters this quarter and next. We have a very targeted set of customers. We're looking at roughly 15 direct customers and 5 partner customers in the Q1 timeframe. We're looking to expand that based upon interest into phase 2 and looking to essentially launch. Again, this is just incorporating enhanced functionality into our existing API management offering, but really looking to launch this more from an enablement and readiness perspective across the organization, so they're familiar with the functionality and our customers are aware of all this large swath of functionality that's headed their way. That's targeted for Q3. And what that means is incorporating those designs of what you just saw before with particularly the dev portal interface, exercising a lot of the gateway functionality that's already in place, right? And as we get into Q4, into next year, it's going to be really a lot of focus specifically on kind of the metrics and dashboarding aspects that you want to have once you're exercising these APIs. You want to have insight into the relative health and consumption of those APIs. So from a forward-looking perspective into Q4 and the next year, what we want to show you is then from a provider side, it's important to have those monitoring capabilities. So what's available today is admittedly somewhat lightweight comparatively where our customers want to be. It does provide you for kind of the number of calls. You can drill through more detail from timeline perspective, right? For periods of time, understand usage trends and the average response time. Obviously, a large set of APIs are available as well for that level of engagement should folks want to create their own reports or export the information. But as we look forward, we want to have a more robust engagement here for the API providers. So having that facility to be able to understand relative health at their fingertips, be able to delve more deeply into some of these as well. So thinking about traffic in general, all the traffic, call durations, errors. I want to delve more deeply specifically into given APIs and understanding relative consumption across applications that may be consuming them, relative duration, etc. Okay. So again, that's from a API provider side. Understanding as well that there is that need from a consumer side as well. So starting to inject these dashboarding capabilities within the dev portal as well. For the consumer, those are the APIs to understand their consumption relative to their established quotas, their relative call duration and call frequency for their consumption. And again, delving more deeply into individual APIs, the types of responses they're seeing, rate limiting, etc., as it pertains to their particular consumption of that. Okay, so that's all targeted for end of this year into early next, specifically to extend the value of our API framework. So with that being said, I welcome any questions you have as follow-up. Again, this is Sean Collins with Dell Boomi, Director of Product Management in charge of our API management offering, and thanks.